Hi, this is Puneet Jain, and today we are going to discuss about the sexual reproduction in the flowering plant. So the first of all thing is that the sexual reproduction. What is the meaning of sexual reproduction? It is the process that involves the two parents, the male and the female parents, and both of these parents are responsible to produce gametes, and these gametes fertilize with each other to produce a new organism. Okay, so in the case of flowering plant, we are having an option of a flower that is a structure, we can say a sexual part of the plant. So we can say a typical angiospermic flower. A typical angiospermic flower is having four structures. The first is called as calyx. The second we can say corolla. The third is androecium and the gynoecium. If we are coming over the structure of the flower, so we can say the flower is having these structures, like there is a kind of a structure that we can say pedicel. This pedicel is responsible for the attachment of any flower with a kind of floral axis, or we can say plant. So it is responsible for the attachment of flower. So we can say whenever the flower is attached with the plant, so it provide a kind of vascular tissues, and due to the presence of the vascular tissues, we can say it provide nutrition within the flower. Okay. The next structure we can say receptacle. Receptacle is basically a swollen area or swollen part of the pedicel that provide the attachment of the each and every part of the flower. Okay. So this receptacle is also called as thalamus. It basically responsible for the attachment of the floral part. The next structure we can say, now we are having the whorls of the flower. Basically, a flower is having two types of whorls. The first is called as non-essential whorl and the second is called as essential whorl. The non-essential whorl is a kind of a structure which is not directly involved in the process of the reproduction, while the essential whorl is called as reproductive whorl, that is directly involved in the process of reproduction. That non-essential whorl is basically having a kind of a structure, we can say calyx and the corolla. Calyx is having its single unit called sepal, while the corolla is having its single unit called petal. While the reproductive whorl is again having two structures, that is androecium and the gynoecium. That androecium is responsible for the production of the pollen grain, while the gynoecium is the structure that is responsible for the production of the female gamete. Okay, and we can say it is having its single unit called carpel. Now we are having this diagram again. In this diagram we can say this sepal is basically a kind of greenish structure that basically provide the protection to the immature flower during its bud condition. Okay, it provide protection to flower during bud condition. Okay. Now the next structure we can say petal. This petal is basically responsible to attract the insects. Okay, it is responsible for the attraction of the insects. It is a kind of colorful structure. It is having a fragrance. So due to having its coloration and the fragrance, it basically responsible for the attraction of insects that directly responsible for the process of pollination, which is again an important process for this sexual reproduction. Now we are having the reproductive whorl, and this reproductive whorl involved for this entire structure called stamen. This stamen produces pollen grain, and pollen grain is responsible for the production of the male gamete, while we are having a structure called stigma, style and the ovary. This structure is called as carpel, and this carpel is responsible for the production of the female gamete called the egg cell. Okay, now the next we can say the male structure, or we can say male reproductive part of the flower, that is stamen, and stamen is also known as microsporophyll or male sex organ. In the structure of a stamen there are two parts. The first we can say anther and the second we can say filament. Anther is a kind of a structure which is having a kind of pollen sacs, and these pollen sacs are responsible for the we can say it provide a space for the growth of the pollen grain, and we can say it is having a kind of sac like structure in which the pollen grains are developed. Okay, while the filament is a kind of a structure that is directly attached to the thalamus, and that thalamus provide directly vascular tissues, and these vascular tissues are responsible to provide nourishment to the developing pollen grains. So while we are having the structure of an anther, so we can say anther is a kind of knob like structure which is a fertile part of this thing. And we can say while we are having the structure of this anther, we can say in this anther there will be a kind of two things. Okay, here we can say this, there is a kind of pollen sacs, and these pollen sacs are responsible. You can say these are the pollen grains, and these pollen grains are present in the pollen sac. So we can say whenever a anther, suppose we are having bilobe, a single lobe of anther is having two pollen sac. Okay, and while we are having two lobe of the anther, that time we can say a bilobed anther, and in that case we are having four pollen sacs, and these pollen sacs can be considered as a microsporangium. So while we are having this structure, so we can say these pollen sacs are having the pollen grains. Okay, this is the structure of any microsporangium. In this microsporangium there are multiple layers are present, and each and every layer is having its own function. It is having a structure like we can say a dithecous structure. Dithecous is basically a kind of a structure that is having four microsporangia. This is the structure of a microsporangia. We can say this is a microsporangia, and this microsporangia is also called as pollen sac, and inside the pollen sac the microspores are developed by the process of microsporogenesis, and this microsporogenesis process is actually responsible for the development of the pollen grain. Now we are having the structure called this entire structure. This entire structure is basically for the pollen grain development. Some of the plants are having a monothecous structures as well. These monothecous structures are basically responsible to have two microsporangia, as these structures are here, and this two microsporangia is only present in the case of Malvaceae family, and hibiscus is an example of that Malvaceae family. Now we are having the structure of the filament. That filament is basically called a kind of sterile structure, which is a long cylindrical stalk like structure, and its proximal end is attached to the thalamus, while the distal end is directly attached to the anther. So this is the structure of the filament. I'm having some of the questions related to this topic, like male sex organ in a flower. So we are having the question, so we know that the answer will be stamen. The second question, a broad knob like fertile part of the stamen is called. So it can be the answer, that is anther. The monothecous anther is seen in, the answer will be hibiscus. Now the next most important topic, that is the transverse section of anther, and inside this topic we are going to discuss each and every layer of the anther and how many layers is present and what are the functions of the layer will be there. So I can explain here. Suppose if we are going to take a transverse section, suppose like this. This is a kind of a structure of a stamen, and I'm going to take a transverse section. While I'm going to take a transverse section, so it almost look like this, okay, by taking a section and placing it under the microscope, it looks like this, and it shows a multiple layer. The outermost layer is called as epidermis. This epidermis is the outermost layer that provide protection. It basically provide protection and we can say while it provide protection, it basically provide the protection to the entire structure of the microsporangium. The next we can say this epidermis is again a kind of unilayered, that is present outermost area of this microsporangium. Now the next structure is called as endothecium. This endothecium is a kind of hygroscopic layer. It is a kind of important layer, and each and every time some of the questions frame from this diagram only. Before last year there was a kind of question, what kind of component or what kind of molecule is present inside the endothecium. So the answer will be alpha cellulose. Alpha cellulose is a kind of substance that is having a hygroscopic nature, and due to its hygroscopic nature we can say it can absorb the humidity of the atmosphere. While it can absorb the humidity, it basically got stretched, the cells become stretched, and we can say while the cell becomes stretched, it basically got burst, or we can say it performed dehiscence, and during the dehiscence all the pollen grains comes out. This will be the process, and we can say this endothecium is responsible for the dehiscence of this stamen. The next we can say the endothecium is again a kind of layer. Suppose I'm going to explain the entire structure of this endothecium. It is having the transverse bands of the alpha cellulose. This transverse band is again a kind of hygroscopic structure, but I am drawing this structure just to explain this extra structure. Okay, some of the cells are devoid for the deposition of the alpha cellulose, and these cells can be considered as stomium. This stomium is basically responsible to perform dehiscence while we can say spring season is there, that is the highest priority, or we can say highest chances of the dehiscence will be there. During the spring season we can say while the humidity is more, so this alpha cellulose absorb more humidity, and in that case we can say these cells become more stressed, and the middle cell cannot be stressed. Okay, so in that case we can say the middle cell become burst and the all pollen grains come out. This will be the criteria. Now the middle layer will be there. Middle layer is basically we can say a multi-layered structure, and this multi-layered structure provide a complete structural integrity of this microsporangium. Okay, it is having 3 to 4 layer that provide structural integrity. The next most important layer that we can say tapetum. That is the most important layer. Tapetum is again a kind of layer that form the boundary of the pollen sac. The boundary of the pollen sac is made up of the tapetum. The first function we can say boundary. It is the only type of cell of a plant that is having a polyploidy due to the presence of endomitosis. Now, what is endomitosis? Endomitosis is a kind of process of cell division in which only karyokinesis occur, no cytoplasmic division occur. That's why the number of nucleus become increases. The next is a kind of nutritive layer. This is the most important feature of this tapetum. This tapetum provides nutrition to the developing pollen grain. And on the basis of the providing of the nutrition, the tapetum can be of two types. It can provide nutrition by its secretion. Okay, it can secrete nutrition into the pollen sac. That time it can be considered as a secretory tapetum, while a small part of this tapetum basically called as protoplast. That protoplast break and mixes within the pollen sac. That time it can be considered as the amoeboid tapetum. So that is basically, we can say, on the basis of nutrition or the type of nutrition, it can be of two types. Now the next thing will be there, while we are going to discuss the formation of the pollen grain from the microspore. This layer is again responsible for the formation of the pollen grain, while we can say it form multiple layers. It is responsible to form multiple layers over the microspore, and by this process we can say microspore develop into the pollen grain. So that is all about